Hello, everybody. I'm Kathleen Merrigan. I'm with the Sweetie Center for Sustainable Food Systems at Arizona State University. Sometimes Arizona State University, the name itself gets in our way. We're pretty much a global university these days, probably the largest in the country. And this is our DC campus. So if you've not been here before, welcome. And for those of you, many of whom I know have been here before, welcome back. So I'm really excited about today's program. I learned first about agroforestry when I was a professor at Tufts University. My doctoral students would come back from Bangladesh all jazzed up about agro what? Because it wasn't something that was in my consciousness, even being a leader, I'd like to believe, in sustainable agriculture in this country. A lot has changed since then. When I was at USDA in my last stint as deputy, I got the true pleasure of releasing what was then the first strategic plan for agroforestry. USDA has since released a second that was like 2019 to 2024. So we must be on the cusp of the third strategic plan, but that's really great. And now we're seeing USDA spend some money, putting out some grants on agroforestry. That's all great. So I learned about agroforestry and I got asked to join the board of trustees of ICRAF, which is the World Agroforestry Center based in Nairobi, Kenya. I thought that's great. And right when I joined, there was a decision that we were going to merge with CIFOR, which is a forestry center that's based in Indonesia. And so a lot of my time, nearly 6 years now, as a member of the board of trustees, has been organizing this merger and thinking about new structures. And new structure includes hiring our first ever, our wonderful new CEO, who I will introduce to you momentarily. I just wanted Dan, as a seasoned veteran of farm bills and all politics that occur in this great city, to offer reflection on what is now maybe, depending how you count, 15 international ag research centers. And my question to him is, does this town know they exist? Is it likely that Congress is going to continue to provide funding for these centers? Just give us a sense of the importance of these places as it is seen in the political lens of town. Mr. Secretary.
Arizona State, which is some of you, most of you know, but it's one of the great universities in the United States, one of the fastest growing, most entrepreneurial schools in America. And I think you have the largest online program in America. And I'm probably speaking to the choir, but I'm delighted to be here. So just quickly, I would just say the CG system is really important. All its centers, some are more well-known than others, and virtually nobody knows about it. So the question is, what do you do about that? Well, in order to, first of all, your targets are Congress and the political world and the government writ large, and not just in agriculture. You know, Napoleon said war is too important to be left to the generals. And so in many cases, we in agriculture talk to each other, and we don't talk to people outside of agriculture. Now that's changing now as people are beginning to find that food and sustainability and reduction of carbon in the atmosphere and all the other things that you're trying to do every day are taking on a resonance that didn't have before. But how do you tell the story? Well, one of the things you have to do is, in the research world, is you have to be able to tell stories. Shakespeare said, the play is the thing, nothing else matters. So if you've got stories to tell, and in the CG system, whether it's in forestry or whether it's in genetics or all sorts of stuff, somehow you got to articulate it in a way so it becomes exciting to people. And not just people in agriculture, it becomes exciting to people who just want to live better, eat better, breathe better. And so I'm not exactly sure what that means. Whether I'm not, and you know, being an old politician, I see a lot of things from the communications messaging side of the picture, but I don't believe that in the research fields generally, but in the CG system specifically, there is enough messaging as to what the substance, what specifics are being done. I was down in Mexico at CIMMYT and spent a day or two there last year. They have just amazing stories to tell and the work that they've done, and not a lot of people know about it. So the big challenge is to get that story out so that policymakers know that what you're doing and what they're doing is important. It makes a difference. It has impact. And then once you do that, it's a little easier to get the resources and the attention. So I've talked long enough. I was given the hook at 2 minutes. I'm just delighted to be here with a lot of friends that I worked with over the years at USDA, and especially to see my friend Kathleen Merrigan. Thank you.
Chances are, if you're here today, you're aware of the urgent need for action centered around the pivotal role for soils, forests, and landscape solutions. And I'm just in good FAO form. We hold 25% of the UN's data, so I got to throw some data at you. Climate change, 31% of greenhouse gas emissions are from agri-food systems, and biodiversity loss, 80% of threatened species are in danger due to land use change driven by agriculture. 70% of fresh water withdrawal is used by agriculture. I think in Arizona, you might know something a little bit about that. 80% of marine pollution comes from the land. 33% of the Earth's soils are degraded, and over 90% could become degraded by 2050. That's still within my lifetime, so that's a scary thought. And then the equivalent of one soccer pitch or football, if you're from outside the United States, one soccer pitch of soil is eroded every 5 seconds. So it's daunting. And sometimes I think those of us in the agri-systems, the agri-food sphere get overwhelmed by the number of problems out there. But there are solutions. When managed sustainably, soils can absorb carbon and help to mitigate climate change. They can also boost biodiversity because 25% of biodiversity is in the soil. I learned that on a trip to Morocco I had the great pleasure of sitting next to the World Food Prize laureate Ratan Lal, who told me he's a soil scientist, and if you ever get to sit next to him in Morocco, you're in for a treat. And then landscapes that integrate forest and agriculture provide habitats for diverse species, contributing significantly to the biodiversity, which I just mentioned. Soils, I think, can sometimes put people to sleep, and that's a very sad thing because during my tenure at USDA, I happened to sit right next to the Natural Resource Conservation Service. My office just happened to be there, and I got to know a lot about the 4 R's, the right amount of fertilizer, the right time and the right amount, and the right fertilizer in the right place. And I think finally, after decades and decades of addressing the conflict between agriculture and the environment, which I don't see as a conflict, but I think it's the narrative is out there. I think finally we're seeing a heyday for soils and agroforestry. So I'm really delighted that we're seeing this and that the World Agroforestry Center and CIFOR combined as a research center can actually move this forward and the research forward for that.
So our new CEO for CIFOR-ICRAF, what a pleasure. Éliane has been in her role since May. You all have a link to her bio as well as the other speakers here. She's really taken on the assignment with huge energy that our organizations have long sought. So I'm really excited that she's here. She has spent a lot of her adult life in Canada. She got her PhD from McGill and in molecular genetics. Yeah, I'm getting the head nod, good. And she has a really long and impressive career already and tons of publications. I'll let you plow through them. But one thing to know is that she is a native of Rwanda. And that is really so deep in her heart and how she views the world. And she brings that perspective of the global South to her new job. CIFOR-ICRAF is in 60 different countries, and many of our people are in the global South. So to have a woman leader from the global South running our institution is, for me, one of the greatest pleasures ever. Éliane, come up and meet the crowd.
It's a real pleasure just for me today to be here with you and talk about a subject that I'm passionate about. In 2014, I actually did a TEDx talk on soils. And so it's wonderful to see where we are in the world today in terms of appreciating the urgency of why we need to be focusing on soils. And so, you said it, I don't have to go there again. And so one of the really important thing is, what are we going to do about the situation we're in? We know how critical investing in soils is, looking at all the SDGs and why we need to be doing these investments everywhere. And they matter as levers to so many things that are critical to living within planetary boundaries. So how we are looking at them is so critical. And what I love about CIFOR-ICRAF is we have 800 scientists, researchers around the world, and we're really working at the interface of how are we leveraging science, how are we influencing policy, how are we allowing innovations to help scale the work we need to do within this space to really elevate the power of soils and why soils are so important. A few years ago, someone said, it's probably 5 years ago, when FAO said we have 60 years left of soil. And so when I said that recently, they're like, Éliane, that 60 years was 5 years ago. So we're going down. And the level of degradation is accelerating. And so we know we need to change how we operate. And so one of the frameworks we have at CIFOR-ICRAF is the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework, which is really a wonderful tool where we bring different types of expertise to make them available to everybody around the world. And this brings expertise from satellite data, remote sensing, as well as citizen science to really support how we're looking at what is happening to reverse soil degradation around the world. And so I'm very excited about the work we're doing and how this can be really helpful around how we can partner around the world in moving forward. Selena and I are having a meeting just this Thursday with the Rwandan Space Agency, the Ministry of ICT, and the Rwandan Ministry of Agriculture around exactly how can we leverage one of these tools to create a baseline data for the country so that they can know how they can move forward in terms of reversing soil degradation. And so we look forward to finding ways how we can do this all over the world and partner with countries and elevate the quantity and granularity of data we already have to really support accelerating, improving soil health globally. And so this is all the areas in the world where we already have data, and what we're looking at is how can we improve the quality and the granularity of data so we can help more communities around the world really be empowered in terms of improving the soil quality where they are. Because one of the realities is we can't produce more food if we have poor soils. And it's such a critical element. We all know that the crisis around fertilizer has affected the capacity to access fertilizer, but most people don't know that degraded soils can't take up the nutrients in the fertilizers to actually help plants grow. And so how we're looking at that is really critical. And so one of the things that's really important is how are we creating the baseline assessments to know where we are? And are we moving in the right direction? Or are we accelerating degradation, like the possibility that by 2050 we could have 95% degraded soils? We don't want to go into that direction. I've been to Haiti where in some areas you're back to the rock. There's no more soil. Rebuilding soil is hard. So being able to preserve the soils we have is a really important element to the work we do at CIFOR-ICRAF. And so what we know is that monitoring soil organic carbon is really important. And we happen to have probably the best soils research laboratory in the world with the most data around tropical soils. And we see this as a really critical tool at that interface of how are we looking at soil around the world, and how are we looking at how are we going to be feeding a growing population going to reach 10 billion people. And so this is a really important around how we're moving forward. And as I said, we're using different types of tools, digital tools, community outreach, participatory work to really integrate how we're working in terms of moving forward on the data we have. And this is really important because as we move towards a more digital world, we really need to make sure we're leaving nobody behind. And this is a really critical element to the work we do because we know that the digital world has blind spots. And I think it's so important that we think about the smallholder farmers that feed 3 out of 4 people on this planet. and to make sure that as we move forward in this digital space, that we don't leave them behind, and that we actually take the immense knowledge that they hold and make sure it becomes available as a global commons, and that we support that work to ensure that they can keep feeding people around the world, but more importantly, that the work they're doing can help decrease malnutrition, that can really increase the rates of adequate food security around the world. And so one of the things that we have within this work is the Regreening Africa app that is being used by hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers in Africa, where we're combining the work of LDSF with citizen science to really support agroforestry on farms. We see it really important because one of the dilemmas we have is in a changing climate, what you planted 10, 20, 30 years ago in one area may not be what you need to be planting this year, 5 years from now, 20 years from now. So we combine the work that really allows us to really understand how do we ensure we're growing trees, not just planting trees. And it's really critical in terms of, as I said, the work we're able to do and the amount of data we've accumulated in our soil laboratory. And I look forward to scaling this even more so that we're able to give governments, give communities more access to their data so that they're able to do what they need to do to restore soil health. And so one of the things that I think is really exciting about the work we do around soils, it's not just work in the laboratory. It's really about how do we take what we're learning and bringing it to policymakers? And how do we actually bring adequate policy that will really allow influencing what countries are doing? We know that they have nationally determined targets, and soil carbon sequestration has been undervalued up to now. And so we see this as a really critical area where especially governments that know that their soils are degraded, there's a lot of work they need to do, because what we need to understand is that when soils have low soil organic matter, not only is it detrimental to carbon sequestration, but it's also detrimental to soil's capacity to hold water. So whether you have rains that are coming fast and furious instead of being spread more evenly around the year, or you have periods of drought, the more soil organic matter you have in the soil, the better your soils are able to withstand these floods or drought events. And so we see how we're influencing policy related to measuring soil organic carbon, parts of the national determined targets, as a really critical element for our work. And so part of the work we're doing as part of the Global Coalition to Scale Soil Health is really around this call to action in terms of how are we working to integrate soil health considerations in policy, how we're looking at research that really needs to allow us to be monitoring what is happening in our soil systems and really be able to increase practices that are increasing soil health. We see this as really critical. And more importantly, the interface of financing, whether it's climate financing, nature financing, we see that soils is a really critical element. We just heard earlier from FAO that 25% of biodiversity is held in soils. So it's really that interface of climate resilience and also restoration of biodiversity that is really critical, that we see this as a significant area to be working in. And so what we do at CIFOR-ICRAF is really we focus on three things. We focus on biodiversity restoration, food security and nutrition, and climate resilience. We have two pathways that we see as really critical, is how are we using sustainable, prosperous value chains to help us really integrate these three challenges and opportunities to move forward to a more equitable world that's creating jobs that are really going to allow us to accelerate the pathways we need to allow restoration of biodiversity to happen, to allow food security to reach a level where we don't have 700 to 800 million people who every day are food insecure, and about 3 billion who have issues of related to food security. And so this window of the 3 billion who can be food insecure and the 700 million who go to bed hungry every day is an opportunity that's really incredible. And so we see this as how we're looking at the interface of reestablishing healthy food systems and looking at how food systems can be critical in terms of growing trees on farms to bring back biodiversity as really critical to how we're looking at climate change and bringing the needed climate resilience. And so we are really critical in terms of how we look at safeguarding biodiversity. I had the pleasure of meeting Wangari Maathai when she was alive, and she's been an inspiration to me. And it's been an immense pleasure to meet her daughter, who now is working with WRI and Bezos Earth Fund, and looking at how can we work together to continue her mother's legacy. And so I love this quote around, it's the little things citizens do that make the difference. And she has this beautiful quote that some of you may know around the hummingbird that's trying to bring water to a forest on fire, and all the other animals that are laughing at the hummingbird saying, what are you going to do in your little beak? You're not going to stop the forest fire. And she's like, well, I'm doing all I can. And it's really about how can we all do all we can to really change the narrative, change the financing, and change the impact of what we're doing all together. So part of the landscape we're working in is the Sahel Mosaic engagement. And we really see this as a critical area in the world to work, not only around restoration of biodiversity, food security, and climate resilience, but also peace building. Because in areas that are insecure, where fragile states, how we are restoring the community's capacity to be resilient will determine how vulnerable they are to terrorism. And so that interface of food security and actual security, we see as a really critical element of the work we do. So in a way, it's also continuing the legacy that Wangari Maathai brought forward around trees for peace. And so we have on our campus in Nairobi trees that she planted. And so whenever I'm stressed, I just go to them and I just think to myself, everything she did, everything she went through, and Kuru Forest that she really helped save is just by our campus. And to think of what she did, and every year there's hundreds of thousands of people who walk through that forest because of the work she did, and many people. And so what can we all do together? How could we create a wonderful landscape in the Sahel? And so what we really see is that as we address these issues, we can work at stabilizing climate. And it's really critical, I think, for many of you, depending on where you are, we can see which cities will be livable in the future, and how much tree cover in cities and rural areas will determine our capacity to have livable spaces. And it's more and more critical and more urgent that we preserve biodiversity needed for this to happen. And so we really see this critical element of why trees matter in terms of climate resilience. And of course, the work on wetlands and mangroves landscape restoration is really critical. I had the opportunity to go to Indonesia in May, where we had our board meeting, but I also went into the field and looked at projects related to mangrove restoration and talked to farmers looking at agroecology and integration of practices to improve their productivity. And the work we're doing is just so critical, again, in terms of climate resilience, because of the critical importance of mangroves to protect us in terms of climate events. And so it's really critical not only for carbon sequestration, but again, also for climate resilience. And so transforming food system is at the core of the work we do. And as a CGIAR center, it's part of the legacy of the CG around how do we feed growing populations around the world. And so we really see our work around the importance of trees on farms in terms of improving soil health, trees on farm, part of the Nutriscape to complement the other crops that are grown on farm in terms of the nutrition of local populations. And we also see it as a critical corridor to connect intact forests and ensure we have biodiversity and we prevent further zoonosis that could bring about more pandemics around the world. And so we really see this as critical to food systems, but really going into One Health. And so part of the work we're doing, one of the examples is the TOFI projects around trees outside the forest in India. We're really seeing a huge impact in terms of the amount of trees we can be growing in India and the capacity of carbon sequestration that we can accelerate. And so this work is critical not only in terms of growing jobs locally, but also, again, addressing our three challenges of restoration of biodiversity, increasing food security locally, and climate resilience. And so we're very excited about this project and moving this forward and having this as an example of what we can learn and scale also elsewhere in the world, taking into account local contexts. And so one of the things that is really critical for us is how are we communicating what we're doing? So GLF, the Global Landscape Forum, is a really wonderful platform where we serve as the co-conveners with about 30 other institutions around the world to bring together dialogues that especially are bringing women, indigenous populations, youth to the conversation and to really encourage restoration around the world. We've had events around finance and climate, finance and nature. We bring together chapters that are looking at restoration through local communities, especially youth-led efforts. And for me, it's really exciting that we're connecting not only the research that is being done through CIFOR-ICRAF from our 800 researchers, but also how are we reaching local communities? And so GLF for me is a very powerful platform for us to move from research to implementation and to access to that last mile of ensuring that the research we're doing is really helping bring about the needed transformation. And so CIFOR-ICRAF has been around for 45 years. In May, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of CIFOR. And so this is a lot of countries that we've impacted. It's a lot of money that's been invested in us. And so I just urgently want more impact of the work we're doing. I want to reach more people in terms of what we're doing, enable more policy transformation towards where we need to be in terms of a nature positive net zero world. And more importantly, I want to empower the smallholder farmers around the world that really are critical stewards of nature and food security for all of us. And so thank you very much.
It's very timely that we're here today, as we in the ag and food security and nutrition communities are thinking more and more about how to meet the challenge of climate change. The roles of trees and forests, environmental services, biodiversity, habitat, water, carbon sink, matter of species survival, even in our own country in the Northern Hemisphere in this continent, but certainly even more so in many of the areas where CIFOR-ICRAF are working. So the other thing, though, just coming back to the food security angle, the Board on International Food and Agricultural Development, chaired by Lawrence Alexander, the president of University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, they convened a climate change subcommittee. And as a result of that, we've been doing some deliberation, and we really think that we have opportunities now that we've been missing, partly because of the climate dimension linked to food security, coffee, cocoa, shea. Huge numbers of smallholder families rely on these crops for their food security, and some of these crops are the most climate vulnerable crops. We already see La Roya in Central America and what that's done to livelihoods and socioeconomic well-being. The other piece that's come up a lot lately, and I want to thank Tom Reardon at Michigan State University for this, is the role of fruits and vegetables and how much those are growing within the food system, how vital they are to nutrition and to raising incomes of producing families. And but what we see is that fruit consumption tends to be largely urban and very income driven. So we need to bring up the productivity, make the prices more affordable for both urban and rural dwellers. This is part of that affordable quality diets that Sweetie and other organizations around the world are pressing us for, in sustainable quality affordable diets. You know, you hit on some of the themes, the soil theme. ICRAF has been a leader in that for decades. I know some of their work in plant nutrition, and really when I heard you talking, Éliane, I thought, well, this has broad relevance for the CGIAR. It's just linked in. And so soil health now, the vision for adapted crops and soils that was mentioned, also raising this issue, both for food security, but also for climate resilience. I guess the bigger issue right now for us is, and this is for the CGIAR, but as well, but it's for the world really, is how do we reconcile our need for food, better nutrition, water and sanitation? How do we reconcile that in within global boundaries that conserve forest biodiversity? How do we and also are the bulwark, are a key bulwark in terms of combating climate change. So we have to reconcile those things. And I guess my sense is, and we need help from people like Kathleen and others in this room, that these challenges, meeting these challenges, rise and fall together. In other words, and Ratan Lal, you mentioned Ratan, he says we've got to give 1 billion or 2 hectares back to nature just to have the carbon sinks that we need to change the trajectory we're on. And that's going to be done a lot through the kinds of tools that CIFOR-ICRAF and other CG centers and universities and our national partners are generating. And a lot of that is knowledge, but it's social science, biophysical science. It's the issues of gender have been raised, equity, but it's also policy and governance. So it's a big challenge, but it's we must not fail. So the final point, I guess, thinking about the CGIAR and people, I'm looking at Ruben Echevarria from the Gates Foundation. We've both been in this area for decades now. But when CIFOR and ICRAF didn't go along with the one CGIAR, and I'm not going to comment on their rationale. Well, I will say something about their rationale. It was a loss. It was no, there's a solution. There's a solution. It was a loss because we all wanted that ridge to reef vision that reconciles those challenges that that you laid out and and Jocelyn mentioned. So they are, I think it's integral to the future of the 1CG. It had some rough starts. I think maybe at the beginning it seemed like the centers were being pushed down. I think that's changed. And I think the 1CG is coming into a much better place with a vision of strong centers. And I guess this is my closing line. I really hope that Dr. Éliane Ubalijoro, I hope I said that right, is going to be the next global director for forests and trees of the CGIAR, as well as your DG for CIFOR and ICRAF. So I'm going to work for that, and I hope you all will work with me. I know the Gates Foundation will. So thanks, everybody. It's great to be here.
There's a lot of discussion about planting trees, the salvation to the soil and the carbon issue. And recently there was a front page story, you may have seen it, I guess it was in the New York Times, about not so fast. We may be planting trees the wrong way. The way we're planting trees may encourage rapid forest fires, for example. And that in our zealousness to try to tree up the world, we may be heating up the world at the same time. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So one of the interesting things around that is there's just a recent Science or Nature article that just came out specifically on this issue, looking at how we plant, how we're restoring forests, and the importance of bringing back diversity in forests. And that if you have monocropped forests, that they're more susceptible to forest fires and not being able to regenerate versus planting mixed forests that really bring back the biodiversity. And this is why the tools we have are so important. This is why the gene banks we have around the biodiversity from tropical forests around the world is so critical. Because as we are seeing a change in climate, we really need to know what is the mix of diverse trees we need to be planting in every area to ensure resilience to fires, to ensure resilience to floods and droughts, and to ensure that those trees are going to grow for as long as they need to. And this is really why we talk about the importance of planting the right trees in the right place at the right time. And how we plant is really a sophisticated science. How we grow trees is an even more sophisticated and powerful science. And it's really critical that people understand you can't just plant anything you want wherever you want. If you're really looking at the long-term survival of humanity, as looking at the heat islands that are happening every year around the world that are making some cities less and less livable in the summers. And so we really see that the expertise we have, whether within the gene banks, whether it's the digital tools that we are offering for the global commons around what needs to be planted where and when and how, we see those as critical knowledge spaces that are created for all to really ensure we're doing the right thing to grow trees, not just plant trees.
This is just a quick comment, and I'm making it because of what Secretary Glickman said a few minutes ago. I recently read an article that makes almost exactly the opposite point of the concern that you, Dan, raised about planting trees the wrong way. And the point of my comment is, if anyone is interested in what I'm about to say, I've got the link right here and I can send you the story. It is called Forest Farming. And it says that for centuries, indigenous people have long tended plants under the canopy of food and medicine. They descended from European settlers, et cetera. So soliciting a comment from you on this concept of forest farming, is that a better way for us to plant trees?
Well, if I look at the origins of ICRAF, the International Center for Research in Agroforestry in 1978, that's exactly the premises of why ICRAF was put in place. And so for me, how we're looking at the wisdom of our ancestors, how we're looking at indigenous knowledge, and in Canada we call it two-eyed seeing, and how we're incorporating it to what we're learning from research science around the world, how we integrate that for me is critical to how we connect the best wisdom of our past to our present to ensure a future that will make us proud to be ancestors. And so how we create that interconnectedness and weave that effectively is really important. And I think one of the challenges has been when you want to do this kind of work, sometimes it's not seen as innovative enough to get research funding, but it's critical in terms of addressing these major challenges we have around biodiversity restoration, food security, and climate. And this builds on tens of thousands of years of indigenous practices that have allowed humanity to live in harmony with nature. And so we need to take that wisdom and integrate it into the amazing science we have today.
Can you make the argument that food is medicine?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As a molecular geneticist, I also have looked at microbiomes, whether we're looking at soil microbiome, gut microbiome. It's the connections of how are we looking at, we have more bacterial cells in us than we have human cells. And so what we know is that in order for health to be in here or in the soil, we need those microbes, those really powerful microbes to be able to do their job. And that requires healthy landscapes, healthy bodies. And this is why we see soil as critical to healthy people and healthy landscapes.
It's clear there's a lot of research out there and a lot to learn, but what are you most excited about or most interested in learning more about and researching more about? Where do you think the opportunities are in terms of like what's next?
So for me, what's next is how do we create more interconnectedness between the wisdom of indigenous peoples and the power of the digital world, the artificial intelligence world. So I have colleagues in Canada and in the US, indigenous colleagues that have created the Indigenous Artificial Intelligence Protocol. So how do we actually, in this digital age, bring the best of our technological age and the best of biological systems and wisdom of our ancestors and bring that all together? And how do we do that in ways that ensure that our young people are going to be the leaders we need to be to really help scale this work. So that's what I'm really excited about.